The morning Virginia Bailey rode into Harlan Creek, the sky was the color of a bruise healing at the edges, and she had $47, a loaded pistol she barely knew how to fire, and a determination that could have split granite clean in two. She had ridden 3 days from Abilene on a borrowed mare that was not built for distance, and the animal was blowing hard by the time the town's single main street resolved itself out of the pale dust and the scrub. Virginia did not slow the mare. She did not look left or right at the storekeepers watching from beneath their awnings, or at the 2 old men sitting outside the barber shop who stopped their conversation as cleanly as if someone had cut a string. She rode straight through, eyes forward, jaw set, because she had learned in 23 years of living that if you showed the world even one corner of your uncertainty, it would take the whole room. The Bishop Ranch was 2 miles south of town, which she had learned from a letter her father's attorney had sent 3 weeks after her father's funeral. The letter had been maddeningly short on feeling and very long on legality, informing her that one roan gelding answering to the name of Cooper had been boarded at the Bishop spread during her father's final illness, that board fees had been paid through the end of the prior month, and that arrangements for the animal's return or continued boarding were to be made at her earliest convenience. Her earliest convenience had taken 3 weeks because grief was not convenient, and because closing down her father's house in Abilene took longer than anyone warned you it would. There were decisions to make about every single object a man had accumulated over 61 years of living, and Virginia had made all of them alone because she had no brothers, no mother, and no husband. She had a second cousin in Missouri who had sent a letter of condolence written in the handwriting of someone who found writing difficult, and that was essentially the whole of her people. So she had packed what she could carry, sold what she could not, and ridden out to collect Cooper, because Cooper was the last thing her father had loved, and she was not going to leave him behind. She found the ranch road by the hand-painted sign nailed to a fence post, the letters reading simply Bishop in black paint that had run a little, giving the letters a quality like something dripping. The road was rutted but well used, flanked by pasture, where a good number of cattle stood in the early light, their breath making small clouds in the September cool. Virginia noted the fences were in good repair. She noted the windmill turning steadily. She noted these things because she was her father's daughter, and her father had always said you could read a man by how he kept his land. The house came into view around a stand of cottonwood trees, and it was not what she expected. She had formed a picture in her mind of a bachelor's house, which was to say something half falling down, the porch full of tack and old boots, the windows filmed with a season's worth of neglect. What she found instead was a low, solid structure of pale limestone, the kind that absorbed the prairie light and gave it back warm. The porch was clean. The flower bed along the front of the house had no flowers in it, but the soil was turned and there were the dry stalks of what had been a good summer's effort. Someone had planted flowers here and tended them, and it made her pause for just a moment before she rode up to the hitching post and climbed down. She had not finished tying off the mare when the front door opened. Jedediah Bishop was not what Virginia had pictured either, though she could not have said afterward what she had pictured exactly. He was tall in the way that prairie-raised men sometimes were, as if the open sky had encouraged them to reach for it. He had dark hair in need of a cut that curled slightly at the collar of his flannel shirt, and a jaw that carried 3 days of dark beard the way a fence post carries the lean of a gate, just naturally, without appearing to think about it. He was somewhere in his early 30s, and he moved across the porch with the unhurried economy of a man who had work to do and intended to do it, right up until the moment his eyes landed on Virginia and he stopped. She was, she knew, not at her best. 3 days of hard riding had done what 3 days of hard riding always did, which was make a person look like something the land had been using for a doormat. Her dark hair was pinned up but barely, and strands of it had escaped in the wind and were whipping across her face in a way she found deeply undignified. She had her father's old traveling coat on, which was a man's coat and too large, and she had the posture of someone who had decided long ago that posture was the one thing the world could not take from her. "Mr. Bishop," she said, because she had also decided long ago that the person who spoke first owned the conversation. He came down the porch steps. That's right. He stopped at a polite distance and looked at her the way a man looks when he is trying to place a face. "I don't believe I know you." "You don't," she said. "I'm Virginia Bailey, Robert Bailey's daughter. I've come for Cooper." Something moved across his face then, a softening that was too quick for her to name before it was gone. "Miss Bailey," he said, and his voice had dropped a register, which meant he knew her father was dead and he was sorry. "I didn't know you were coming. I'd have made arrangements." "What kind of arrangements does a horse require?" she asked, and she meant it as a practical question, but she heard it come out with more edge than she intended. He was quiet for a moment, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing through the edge to what was underneath it. "The kind where you have a meal and a place to rest before we figure out how you plan to get him back to wherever you're headed," he said, and then he looked at her borrowed mare, and the look told her he had already assessed the animal and found it unlikely to manage the return trip without some intervention. Virginia followed his gaze to the mare and then looked back at him. "She'll be fine," she said. "She needs 2 days of rest and a good bucket of feed before she goes another mile," he said, not unkindly. It was true, and Virginia knew it was true, and hating that it was true did not make it less true. "All right," she said, after a moment that was perhaps half a beat too long. He nodded and moved to take the mare's reins, and his hand brushed hers in the process, which was an accident of proximity and nothing more, but Virginia felt it in a way that surprised her, a small electric thing that traveled up her arm before she had the sense to ignore it. "I'll get her settled," he said. "Come up to the house. There's coffee." She followed him around to the barn, and the barn was as well kept as the rest of the property. Stalls clean, tools hung on proper pegs, the smell of hay and horse and good honest work. And there, in the third stall from the end, was Cooper. Virginia had not expected the way she would feel when she saw him. Cooper was 11 years old, a roan gelding with one white sock on his left foreleg, and a broad, intelligent face that her father had always said was the face of a horse that understood more than he let on. Her father had loved that horse with an uncomplicated and devoted love that she had sometimes, shamefully, envied. And now Cooper turned from his water bucket and looked at her with those dark, patient eyes. And Virginia Bailey, who had not cried at her father's funeral because there had been too much to manage and too many people watching, felt the grief rise up in her throat like a tide. She put her hand on Cooper's nose and pressed her forehead against his broad face, and she breathed, and she did not cry, but it was a close and terrible thing. Behind her, she heard Jedediah Bishop quietly settling the borrowed mare into an adjacent stall, not saying anything, not making her feel observed, and she was grateful for it with a gratitude that was out of proportion to the small consideration it represented. When she straightened and turned around, he was filling a water bucket and deliberately not looking at her, and she understood that this was a courtesy. "He looks well," she said, her voice steady. "He's a good horse," Jedediah said. "Easy to care for, smart." Down the bucket. "Your father visited him every week until he couldn't make the trip anymore." Virginia had not known that. "He didn't tell me that," she said. Jedediah looked at her then. "He talked about you every time he came out. Said you were the most capable person he'd ever known and that he worried about you for exactly that reason." She did not know what to do with that, so she did what she always did with things she did not know what to do with, which was set them aside for later. "How did you know him?" she asked instead. "My father. How did he come to board Cooper here?" Jedediah picked up a curry comb and began working it through Cooper's coat, and Cooper sighed the way horses do when they are being attended to properly. "He came through about 8 months ago. I'd lost a mare that spring. Coyotes got to the foal and she never recovered from it, and I had an empty stall. He was looking for a place to board Cooper while he dealt with some business in town that kept getting extended." He paused, and the curry comb worked in slow, careful circles. The business turned out to be his health. I expect you know that better than I do. Kidney trouble, Virginia said. He was too stubborn to go to a proper doctor in Abilene for 2 years. By the time he saw the doctor here, there wasn't much to be done. Jedediah nodded slowly. He was a stubborn man. The most stubborn man I have ever encountered in my life, Virginia said, and something about the way she said it was almost fond. He would have disagreed with a stone wall if he thought the wall was wrong. Jedediah almost smiled. It was not quite a full smile, but the corner of his mouth moved in a way that changed his whole face, made it warmer, made it more like something she wanted to look at for longer than was strictly necessary. He tried to pay me 3 months in advance for board the first time he came out, he said. I told him 1 month was fine. He paid 3 anyway and said he didn't want to be beholden. That is the most Robert Bailey thing I have ever heard, Virginia said. This time Jedediah did smile, fully, and it lasted only a moment, but it was a good smile, the kind that reached his eyes and changed them from guarded to open. And Virginia felt something she recognized with some alarm as interest, the particular sharpening of attention you felt around someone who turned out to be more than the shape of them suggested. She looked away at Cooper instead. They went inside for coffee, and the inside of the house surprised her again. It was tidy in the way that a man who lives alone manages when he cares about things, which was different from the tidiness of a woman, less about appearances and more about function. The kitchen was plain but well organized. There were books on a shelf near the fireplace, which she noted. There was a framed photograph of 2 older people on the mantel that she assumed were his parents, and a smaller photograph of a young man in Union uniform that made her look away quickly, not wanting to ask. There were no signs of a woman having been here recently, which she told herself she was noting only as a matter of general awareness and nothing more. He poured coffee from an iron pot and set a cup in front of her, and then sat down across the table with his own cup, and they looked at each other in the way that 2 strangers do when they have already covered the easy ground of introduction, and the next conversation has not yet announced itself. "Where are you headed?" he asked. "After you collect Cooper." It was a reasonable question, and she did not have a reasonable answer, which was its own kind of problem. "I'm not certain," she said, because she had decided she was done lying about things to smooth them over. "The house in Abilene is sold. I have some money from the estate, not a great deal, but enough to be careful with for a time. I thought I might go to Denver. I have an acquaintance there who mentioned there was teaching work." "Thought you might go," he repeated, and the way he said it made her aware of how provisional it sounded. "I'm still deciding," she said, with more dignity than the sentence deserved. He nodded and drank his coffee and did not say anything else about it, which she appreciated, and also found faintly maddening because most people pressed, and she had prepared to defend her vagueness, and now she had nowhere to put that defense. "You said the mare needs 2 days," she said. "At least," he said. "And Cooper's going to need a second horse or a wagon for the trip, depending on where you're going. He's used to being ridden, but you can't ride 2 horses. I'm aware of how horses work," she said. "I'm sure you are," he said equably. She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. He was looking back at her with an expression of patient, unhurried attention that was somehow more disconcerting than any number of more dramatic expressions might have been. Most men she had encountered either talked too much around her or became visibly uncomfortable with her directness. Jedediah Bishop appeared to be neither charmed nor discomfited. He appeared to be simply present, paying attention, as if she were a weather system he was observing with interest and no particular need to predict. "I'll stay 2 days then," she said. "I can pay for the mare's board and for Cooper's. What do you charge?" He told her, and it was a fair price, and she told him so, which seemed to surprise him slightly. "Most people argue," he said. "Most people argue because the price is wrong," she said. "Your price is fair." He nodded. "I'll get the spare room ready." "I can sleep in the barn," she said automatically, and then heard herself say it and felt faintly ridiculous. "The spare room has a bed," he said. "The barn has horses. Sleep in the room." She stayed in the room. The first full day she spent at the ranch was a revelation of sorts, though not the kind that announced itself with any particular fanfare. It simply accumulated, the way understanding always does when you pay attention, detail by detail. Jedediah Bishop was up before dawn, and Virginia, who was herself an early riser, came out to find him already in the yard, dealing with the business of a ranch that became apparent in its full scope only once the light came up. He had 12 head of cattle, which was not a large operation, and 4 working horses, plus Cooper and her borrowed mare. He had a hired hand named Otis who came out from town 3 days a week, a wiry old man of indeterminate age who chewed tobacco with the dedication of a man who had committed to something and intended to see it through. Jedediah had chickens, which he managed with complete unself-consciousness, and a kitchen garden that had produced well through the summer and was now being put to bed for the fall. Virginia found herself helping without quite deciding to. It began with the chickens, because she knew chickens and Jedediah's rooster was behaving like a tyrant and she knew how to deal with that. And then it extended to the kitchen garden because she could see it needed clearing. And by mid-morning she was pulling dead vines alongside Jedediah and Otis in a companionable silence that she found unexpectedly comfortable. Otis was the one who broke the silence, which Otis did frequently, as Virginia would come to understand. "Your daddy was a good man," he said to her, conversationally from the next row over. "Used to come out and help Jed with the fencing when his health was still all right. Didn't have to, but he did. Said he couldn't stand to watch a man work alone." Virginia looked up. "That sounds right," she said. "He told Jed to look out for you," Otis said, with the absolute absence of tact that comes with being very old and having decided the time for tact was behind you. "Said you'd probably argue with whoever he sent looking, and they'd have to be stubborn about it." Virginia turned to look at Jedediah, who was not looking at her, who was instead focused with great intensity on a section of dead vine that did not require that much intensity. "Did he?" she said. Jedediah glanced up, and there was something in his expression that was almost sheepish, which on a man of his particular self-possession looked extraordinary. "He asked me to make sure you got back to wherever you were going safely," he said. "I was going to bring it up." "When?" she asked. "After the coffee the next morning," he said, "which was going to be this morning, but Otis has apparently made his own schedule." "I don't need looking out for," Virginia said. "Your father said you'd say that," Otis offered helpfully. "Otis," Jedediah said. "I'm just saying," Otis said, and returned to his vines. Virginia pulled a dead tomato plant from the earth with perhaps more force than strictly necessary. The request, she thought, was typical Robert Bailey, arming someone else with the job of caring for her rather than telling her himself that he was worried. Managing her from beyond the grave the way he had always managed her from across the room, with a careful indirection that was somehow both aggravating and deeply tender. She sat with her irritation for a while and then set it down, because the truth was that her father had known her, and he had known that she would dismiss his worry if he expressed it directly, and he had found a way around her that was smarter than her defensiveness, and she could not in honesty be angry at him for loving her cleverly. "Fine," she said, to no one in particular. Jedediah pretended he hadn't heard, which was its own kind of thoughtfulness. The afternoon took a different turn. Virginia was in the barn with Cooper, brushing him out and talking to him the way she had always talked to animals, straightforwardly and with the assumption of comprehension, when she heard the sound of a rider coming up the ranch road at a speed that was not friendly. She stepped out of the barn and Jedediah was already on the porch, and the rider who came into the yard was a young man of perhaps 20, red-faced and breathing hard, on a horse that had been pushed. "Jed," the young man said, "it's the Alderton boys. They've cut your fence on the south pasture, and 2 of your steers are through into their land. They're saying they'll keep them against the debt." Jedediah's face went very still in a way that Virginia was beginning to recognize as the particular stillness of a controlled man approaching the limits of his control. "What debt?" he said. "They're saying your daddy owed their daddy money, and it passed down with the land." the young man said. "Dale Alderton's got a paper he's waving around." Jedediah came down from the porch with the particular purposefulness of a man who has already made a decision without appearing to have thought about it. He looked at Virginia and she saw him weigh something. "Stay here," he said. "I will not," she said. He looked at her for one more moment and then seemed to calculate that arguing would cost more time than it was worth. "Then come," he said. They rode out to the south pasture, Jedediah on a big black horse named Samson that moved like a statement, and Virginia on Cooper, who was rested enough for it, and who she discovered moved with the smooth, collected gait she had heard her father describe but never experienced herself. The young man, whose name was Caleb and who seemed to work a neighboring spread, rode alongside them. The Alderton brothers were three, all of them larger than was comfortable, and all of them standing on the wrong side of the cut fence as if they owned it. The oldest was Dale, and Dale had a folded piece of paper in his hand, and an expression that mixed genuine grievance with the enjoyment of that grievance in a way Virginia recognized as dangerous. The steers were grazing peaceably on Alderton grass, which in any other context would have been pastoral and pleasant. Jedediah rode up to the fence line and stopped Samson and looked at the paper Dale held. "Let me see it," he said. Dale unfolded it and held it up rather than handing it over, which was the move of someone who wanted to control the document. Jedediah looked at it from horseback with an expression that gave nothing away. Virginia looked at it from beside him and found, to her considerable surprise, that she could read most of it at that distance, because she had grown up watching her father review contracts, and he had taught her to look for the important parts quickly. "That's not a debt instrument," she said, before she had quite decided to speak. "That's a promissory note and it's dated 1869. Promissory notes don't transfer with land. And even if they did, the statute of limitations in this territory would have run out years ago." All four men on the other side of the fence looked at her. Jedediah, she noticed from the corner of her vision, looked at her with an expression she could not immediately interpret. Dale Alderton's jaw worked for a moment. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am. It concerns me that someone is trying to take property under a legal instrument they don't understand," she said pleasantly. "What did you use for the fence cutters? Because you'll owe Mr. Bishop for the repair." There was a silence that stretched in several directions at once. "Your father was a lawyer," Jedediah said quietly, not to anyone in particular. "He was," she said, "and he was very fond of explaining things to me." The Alderton boys exchanged a look that was mostly about the particular discomfort of being outmaneuvered by a woman who was being perfectly civil about it. Dale refolded the paper. "This isn't over," he said, but it was the statement of someone withdrawing rather than someone preparing. "I'll send Otis out to fix the fence," Jedediah said. "I'd like my steers back this afternoon." The steers were returned. The fence was mended. And on the ride back, Jedediah rode beside Virginia for a half-mile in silence before he said, "Thank you. I wasn't going to let him take your cattle on a 20-year-old promissory note," she said. "Still," he said. And then, after another pause, "Your father said you were capable." "My father had opinions about everything," she said. "He wasn't wrong about that one," Jedediah said, and this time the warmth in his voice was unmistakable, and Virginia looked straight ahead at the ranch house coming into view between the cottonwoods and told herself that the warmth she felt in response was simply the afternoon sun. That evening, after a supper that Jedediah cooked without any particular fuss, and that was better than she expected, they sat on the porch in the long September dusk, while the first stars appeared one by one, as if someone were lighting lamps in a very high ceiling. The air smelled of sage and cooling earth and something distant that might have been rain. The cattle made their evening sounds in the near pasture. Cooper nickered once from the barn and then was quiet. Virginia had a cup of coffee and Jedediah had his, and they sat in two chairs that faced the open land, and the silence between them had changed from the silence of strangers to something with more ease in it. "How long have you been alone out here?" she asked, and then immediately felt it was too personal. But he answered without hesitation. 3 years, he said. My father passed in 1879. My mother went back to her people in Georgia. My brother, he stopped for just a moment and his eyes went to the middle distance. My brother didn't come back from the war. That was the photograph on the mantel, the young man in the Union uniform. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it in the full and tired way she meant most things. It was a long time ago, he said, but some things stay close regardless of how much time puts itself between you and them. She understood that. She understood it exactly. My mother died when I was 9, she said. I still reach for her sometimes. In the morning, when something has happened that I want to tell her. Jedediah looked at her, and the look was quiet and serious and without the awkwardness that most people brought to someone else's grief. What would you have told her, today, I mean? Virginia considered the question, which surprised her because no one ever asked the follow-up. That I found my father's horse, she said, and that he was being well kept, and that my father had thought of everything right up to the end. She paused. And that I think I am going to be all right, even though I don't entirely know where I am going. That's a good thing to be able to say, he said. It's the first time I've managed to say it and believe it, she admitted, which was more honesty than she had intended, and she looked out at the darkening land as if she had not just handed him something. He did not make a thing of it. He just nodded once, slowly, as if she had said something that settled like a stone into still water, and he was watching the rings. They stayed on the porch until full dark, and the conversation moved from grief to more ordinary things, and then to stranger things, which was how Virginia learned that Jedediah Bishop had opinions about the nature of clouds that she found eccentric and fascinating, and that he had read more books than she would have expected, and that he had once ridden to Santa Fe for no reason he could adequately explain and spent a week there, and come back knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. She learned that he was 32 years old, which put him 9 years ahead of her, but age had never interested her much as a category. She had known 20-year-olds who were ancient and 50-year-olds who were still learning how to be alive. She told him about Abilene and about her father's law office where she had worked as his assistant for 5 years, doing work that in a different world might have come with a proper title and a proper salary. She told him about the injustice of that without bitterness, simply as a fact, the way the land was arranged in 1882 in the state of Kansas, which was that women did the work and men signed the papers. She told him she had applied to the Bar Association once as an experiment and had received a letter back that was so politely dismissive it had almost made her laugh. He listened to all of it. He did not offer solutions or reassurances. He did not tell her things would change soon, which was what people said when they did not want to sit with the actual difficulty of the truth. He just listened and asked questions and looked at her as if what she was saying was worth the full weight of his attention. It was, Virginia thought, the most she had talked in 6 months. The next morning began quietly, with the particular quality that second days at a new place have, the strangeness worn down to something more comfortable, the rhythms becoming slightly familiar. She helped with breakfast without being asked, and he divided the tasks without discussion, and they worked in the kitchen in a domestic shorthand that felt practiced even though it was brand new, and this struck her as both pleasant and worth being careful about. After breakfast, Otis arrived and took himself off to mend the remainder of the south fence, making his opinions about the Alderton family known to the morning at large as he went. Jedediah saddled Samson and told Virginia he was going into Harlan Creek on some business and asked if she needed anything from town. "I'll come with you," she said. He looked as though he was going to object, and then looked as though he had thought better of it. "All right," he said. They rode into town together, and Virginia became aware of the attention this generated in the way that small towns always generated attention around anything that deviated from the established order. She was a stranger, and she was riding beside Jedediah Bishop, who she gathered from various small evidences was someone the town had opinions about. Specifically, the opinion that he kept himself too separate, that he was pleasant enough when encountered but never quite let himself be part of things, that since his father had died, he had worked his land and attended to his affairs, and declined every social invitation with the firm politeness of a man who had arranged his life, according to a careful plan that included no complications. She gathered all of this not from anything Jedediah said, but from the way people greeted him, with a warmth that had a question built into it, and from the way they greeted her, with the particular bright curiosity of people who saw an anomaly and wanted to understand it. The town itself was what 1882 had made of this part of the territory, which was to say a main street of maybe 15 buildings, a saloon that opened early and closed late, a general store, a land office, a church that had been built optimistically large, a schoolhouse that was exactly the right size, a small hotel, and the various commercial enterprises that attended a cattle town of modest ambitions. It was not Santa Fe and it was not Abilene, but it was real and solid, and the people in it clearly felt that it was theirs. Jedediah's business was at the general store and involved a delivery of fence wire that had been delayed, and a fairly pointed conversation with the store owner about what constituted a reasonable delay. Virginia looked at the dry goods while this was happening and discovered that the store had, tucked in a back corner, a small selection of books, mostly almanacs and a few well-handled novels, and a volume of poetry by someone she had read before, and she bought the poetry collection for 30 cents because it seemed like the kind of thing that would be companionable on whatever road lay ahead of her. They were coming out of the store when a woman on the boardwalk stopped them. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the setting, with sharp eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to having information. "Jedediah," she said warmly, and then looked at Virginia with undisguised interest. "Mrs. Harlan," he said, "this is Miss Bailey. She's staying out at the ranch to collect her father's horse." "Robert Bailey's daughter," Mrs. Harlan said, and her face shifted into something genuine and kind. "Oh, my dear, your father was a good man. I was so sorry to hear of his passing. He was quite beloved in this town, you know, for the months he was here." Virginia had not known. "He didn't tell me much about his time here," she said. "He played cards on Friday evenings, Mrs. Harlan said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world, which she supposed it was. "He was not very good at cards, but he was wonderful company. He had a story for every situation." "That is absolutely accurate," Virginia said. "He talked about you constantly," Mrs. Harlan said. "We all feel as if we know you. He was so proud." She paused and then said, with no apparent awareness of any impropriety, "We have a schoolteacher position here, Miss Bailey." The woman who held it moved on in August. "It's been quite the difficulty. If you were considering staying in the area, she's headed to Denver," Jedediah said, with a neutrality that she could not parse. "I'm still deciding," Virginia said, which was true and which she aimed slightly in Jedediah's direction without entirely meaning to. Mrs. Harlan looked between them with the expression of a woman who processed social information at speed. "Well," she said pleasantly, "do think about it, Miss Bailey. The children are quite in need, and Harlan Creek is a good town. Your father thought so." They walked back to the horses in a silence that was different from the easy silence of the previous evening, this one containing something unresolved. "You didn't have to answer for me," Virginia said, when they were clear of the main street. "I wasn't answering for you," he said. "I was repeating what you told me." "I said I was still deciding," she said. He adjusted Samson's reins and looked straight ahead at the road. "You did," he said. "So you know I'm still deciding," she said. "I do," he said. She waited, but he did not add to it, and she found that the waiting was doing something to her, a kind of accumulated tension that had no name yet but was making itself known in the particular sharpness with which she was aware of his profile, the line of his jaw, the way he sat a horse as if he and it had reached a long-standing agreement about who was in charge of what. She looked back at the road and told herself she had 2 days here. She told herself she had exactly 2 days. The afternoon brought a thunderstorm that announced itself from the west with the theatrical buildup that Great Plains storms always managed, the sky going from blue to the particular bilious green of serious intent, the wind picking up with a cold authority that sent the chickens into the coop and made the cattle move toward the low part of the pasture. Virginia and Jedediah got the horses into the barn and secured what needed securing and made it back to the house just ahead of the first heavy wall of rain. The house was warmer with the storm outside, the sound of rain on the limestone roof, a deep, even percussion that filled the space. Jedediah lit the oil lamp and put more wood on the fire, and Virginia stood at the window watching the lightning move across the prairie in great branching arcs and thought that it was the most beautiful and frightening thing she had seen in some time. "Does it storm like this often?" she asked. "In September, yes," he said from behind her. "The land makes its last argument before winter comes." She turned from the window. He was sitting at the table with the lamp between them, and he had gotten out a ledger book that he had presumably intended to work on, but he was not working on it. He was looking at her. "What are you thinking?" she said, because the look was one that held something, and she was tired of not asking. He was quiet for a long enough moment that she thought he would deflect. Then he said, "I'm thinking that this house has been very quiet for 3 years, and that I had stopped noticing how quiet it was until you got here." Virginia felt something shift in her chest, something that had been held carefully in place moving in a way that was not quite comfortable and not at all unpleasant. "That is either a very kind thing to say or a very alarming one," she said. "Both, I expect," he said. She came away from the window and sat down across the table from him, which was the same seat she had occupied for breakfast and dinner and coffee and every conversation of the past 2 days, and which had already acquired a quality of familiarity that surprised her. "Jedediah," she said, using his name for the first time with that weight in it, not as a form of address but as a way of saying I am talking to you now specifically, directly. "I have been trying to be sensible." "I know," he said. "I came here for a horse," she said. "I know," he said. "I don't have a plan that includes," she gestured slightly helplessly, which was not a gesture she made often. "I know," he said for the 3rd time, and the repetition was not dismissive but rather the sound of a man who had been thinking the same thoughts from his own side and had reached the same impasse. "I'm not asking you to have a plan. I'm just—" He stopped, and what he was doing, she realized, was being careful with something fragile. "I'm just telling you it's been quiet." The lightning moved outside and the thunder followed it, rolling through the land like something being rearranged. The lamp on the table between them made the room small and warm and separate from the storm. "I looked at the school when we were in town," she said. "The building, through the window." He was very still. "It needs work," she said. "The bookshelves are practically empty, but it has good light." "It does," he said carefully. "I'm not saying anything," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm just noting that I looked," she said. "I noticed that you noticed," he said, and there was the ghost of that smile again, the one that made his eyes change, and she felt the warmth of it in a way that had absolutely nothing to do with the fire and the hearth. They played cards that evening because Jedediah found a deck that had belonged to his father, and Virginia turned out to be extremely good at cards in a way that clearly surprised him, and this delighted her in a manner she could not entirely suppress. The storm continued outside, becoming more of a steady rain as the evening went on, and the fire burned down to coals, and they sat at the table with the cards between them and the lamp between them, and the conversation moving from cards to the cards her father had played, and the people he had played them with, and from there to the things the town had told her about her father's last months that she had not known, and from there to the more difficult question of what it meant to be the thing that remained after a person was gone, the person who carried the thread of someone's life forward. "Do you think about your brother?" she asked. "I mean regularly, not just sometimes." "Yes," he said. "We used to argue about everything. I was the stubborn one and he was the reckless one, and together we were the most exhausting pair of young men our mother had ever encountered." He looked at the cards in his hand. After he died, I realized I had been waiting to stop being stubborn long enough to tell him I loved him, and I ran out of time. He put his cards down. So now I try not to wait. Virginia set her own cards down. Across the table, the lamp between them, she looked at Jedediah Bishop, and she thought that her father had been smarter than she gave him credit for, and that grief was a strange navigator, and that the land outside was dark and wet and full of September stars behind the clouds, and that she was not in any hurry to be anywhere else. "I think I would like to stay for a while longer," she said, "if that is all right." Something in his face opened, a slow and careful opening, like a door in a house that has been closed against weather for a very long time. "That is very much all right," he said. She wrote to Mrs. Harlan the next morning about the teaching position. The weeks that followed were a kind of becoming, gradual and specific, and built of the particular material of daily life. Virginia moved from the spare room into the main life of the ranch with the naturalness that surprised her, because she had always thought of herself as someone who held back, who observed before committing, who protected her own ground. But the ranch was a place that rewarded presence, that required it, and she found she wanted to be present in a way she had not wanted anything for a long time. She took the teaching position, and every weekday morning she rode Cooper the 2 miles into Harlan Creek and into the schoolhouse, which she reorganized with a thoroughness that sent Mrs. Harlan into appreciative raptures. She acquired books through a combination of purchase, donation solicitation, and a very firm letter to the Territorial Education Board that produced results in a way firm letters sometimes did when the person writing them had grown up watching a lawyer work. She had 11 students ranging from age 6 to 14, and they were variously enthusiastic, reluctant, clever, slow, funny, and exhausting, and she loved the work with a completeness she had not anticipated. She rode home to the ranch in the afternoons, and there was always, she noticed, something that required Jedediah to be in the yard or near the barn around the time she came up the road. He was never obviously waiting, but he was also never absent, and the greeting was always easy, always warm, always the specific warmth of someone who is glad to see you and not troubled by being glad. They talked every evening. This was the thing, Virginia thought, that she had not expected to need as much as she did. The conversation. The particular quality of talking to someone who listened with their full attention and thought before they responded, and never made her feel she was too much or too direct or too certain of herself. Most of the men she had known in her life had found her certainty challenging, had wanted her to soften it, to offer it as a question rather than a statement, to make it easier for them. Jedediah never asked her to be smaller. He simply brought himself to the same size as whatever the conversation required, and met her there. November came and turned the cottonwoods to gold and then stripped them. The cattle were moved to the lower pasture. Otis discovered he had a bad knee and became, if anything, more philosophically committed to discussing it than he was to mending it. Virginia organized a small lending library using the corner of the schoolhouse and Mrs. Harlan's considerable social energy, and it became, unexpectedly, a small social institution in the town, the kind of thing that gave people a reason to stop and talk that was distinct from the saloon and the church, which together covered most of the existing conversational territory. She noticed, in November, that she had stopped thinking about Denver. She noticed, also in November, that Jedediah was sometimes watching her from a distance when he thought she was not aware of it, and that when she caught him at it, he did not look away with any particular embarrassment, but simply let the look hold for a moment before returning to whatever he had been doing, as if he had decided he was not going to be ashamed of paying attention. It was on a Thursday in late November that things shifted from the warm and careful space they had inhabited to something that had to be named. Virginia had stayed late at the schoolhouse, working on a set of arithmetic problems she was preparing, and it was darker than she intended by the time she started for home. Cooper knew the road and she trusted him, but the temperature had dropped sharply, and there was ice in the puddles from the morning's rain. And halfway home, a branch had come down across the road in the previous night's wind, and Cooper shied from it with a suddenness that was understandable but that sent Virginia sideways, and then off entirely, landing on the hard ground with an impact that she would feel for the next several days. She was not seriously hurt. This was the first thing she established, because she was a practical person. She had landed on her side and she would have a bruise the full length of it, but nothing was broken and nothing was bleeding, and she was in the road 2 miles from home in the dark and the cold, and Cooper, to his eternal credit, had not run. He stood 10 feet away looking at her with the expression of a horse who is sincerely apologetic. She was in the process of talking herself back to her feet when she heard hoofbeats coming from the direction of the ranch, and then there was the lantern swinging, and then there was Samson, and then there was Jedediah. He was off the horse and beside her before she had finished standing up, his hands on her shoulders, the lantern held to one side throwing light across her face. "What happened?" he said, and his voice had shed its usual reserve in a way she had not heard before, something raw and urgent in it. Cooper shied, she said. "I'm fine, I fell, I'm fine." His hands on her shoulders did not let go. He was looking at her with an intensity that was not the intensity of practical assessment but something else, something larger than the moment. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I'll have a bruise," she said. "Jedediah, I am fine." He breathed out, a long breath, and his forehead dropped briefly to her shoulder in a gesture that was so unguarded it stopped her completely. It lasted only a second and then he straightened, and she could see him reassemble himself. But the reassembling was incomplete this time, the careful reserve not quite back in place, his face more open than she had ever seen it. "I saw you weren't back and I thought," he stopped. "I was worried," he said, which was a much smaller version of what she could see had actually happened. "You were worried," she said softly. "Yes," he said. She looked at him in the lantern light, in the cold November air with the stars very clear overhead, and the branch still across the road and Cooper watching them both with patient equanimity. She looked at Jedediah Bishop, and she thought that she had been trying to be sensible for a very long time and that sensible was an excellent thing to be, and that it was also sometimes a way of being afraid and calling it something else. "I wasn't just considering Denver," she said. "I was using Denver as a reason not to think about staying here for the reason I actually want to stay here." He was absolutely still. "Because I have come to care for you," she said, with the directness that was the only way she knew to say important things. "Considerably. And I wanted to tell you that directly because I have spent enough time in my life saying things sideways." He took one step toward her, which was the only step needed, and he took her face in both hands and he looked at her with that open, careful look that she had first seen as guarded and understood now was simply the opposite, a man who felt things with great depth and had learned to be careful with them, because the world was not always kind to depth. "Virginia," he said, and the way he said her name was the way you say a thing that has been true for longer than you have been saying it. "Yes," she said. He kissed her in the lantern light on the road between the ranch and Harlan Creek, and it was not dramatic in any theatrical sense, but it was the kind of kiss that meant something had been decided, something that had been building through weeks of evenings and mornings and conversations and silences, and the particular quality of attention paid between two people who are finding each other, slowly, out of the common material of ordinary days. When they separated, his hands were still at her face and she had both of hers on his chest and the cold was very clear around them, and the stars were doing what stars do in November on the open prairie, which is to be more present than anything else in the sky. "I have been waiting," he said, "for you to decide." "I've decided," she said. "Good," he said, and kissed her again, which resolved any remaining ambiguity on the subject. He rode beside her back to the ranch, and the lantern made a small moving circle of warmth in the dark. December arrived and brought its particular austerity, the land going to the spare, clean lines of the season, the sky very large and the days short, and the evenings long and warm in the ways that mattered, which was to say warm with company and with the fire, and with the conversation that had become, Virginia thought, the thing she most looked forward to in any given day. She had sent a letter to her second cousin in Missouri informing her of her current situation and general happiness, and had received back a letter written in that effortful handwriting that was clearly the product of genuine goodwill, which said simply that it sounded as though Virginia had found something worth staying for, and that her father would have been pleased, and that she hoped Virginia would write again. Virginia wrote again. She wrote often, because she had discovered that happiness was a thing she wanted to share rather than contain, and her second cousin was the nearest available recipient. She also wrote to a woman she knew in Abilene who was a teacher, and that letter was about resources and curriculum, and the response was long and useful, and came with a parcel of donated books that arrived just before Christmas and made Virginia cry a little, which she did in the barn with Cooper while Jedediah pretended not to notice from the door, and then came in and handed her a handkerchief without comment. "I am not usually this easily undone," she said. "I know," he said. "But sometimes things accumulate." "They do," she said, and pressed her face briefly against his shoulder, which was becoming a thing she did, and which he received with the steadiness of someone who had decided he was the right person to be steady for her. Christmas in Harlan Creek was a modest affair by certain standards and very grand by others. The church was full. The children from the school performed a reading that Virginia had organized, and that went moderately well considering that the youngest three had no particular understanding of performance, and one of the middle children was suffering from a cold that added unrehearsed sound effects. Mrs. Harlan organized a supper at her house for various members of the community who had no immediate family nearby, and she included Virginia and Jedediah without any visible subtlety at all. And the dinner was excellent, and the company was warm, and Virginia sat at that table, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the sense of belonging to a place specifically, of a community that was willing to include her. Afterward, she and Jedediah walked back through the town in the December dark, the cold very sharp and the town very quiet, and she had her hand in the crook of his arm and their breath made clouds in the air, and he said, "Stay." It was a single word, and it was everything. She looked up at him on the quiet street with the stars above and the warm lantern light from the various windows around them. "I'm staying," she said. "I thought we had established that." "I mean stay," he said, and looked at her directly. "Marry me, stay." Virginia was quiet for a moment, not because she was uncertain, but because she wanted to say it right. "Jedediah Bishop," she said. "I came to your ranch to collect a horse, and I have stayed for 3 months, and in that time I have become more myself than I have been in years, and I attribute that entirely to you. So yes. Obviously yes." He laughed, which was one of the rarer gifts, and she loved the sound of it. He pulled her close and kissed her on the cold street in the small town in the dark in the middle of December 1882, and 2 dogs from Mrs. Harlan's property observed this with great interest and then lost interest and wandered off, because dogs have their priorities. They were married in February, because February was when the land was at its most honest about what it required of you, stripped down to its essentials, and Virginia had always liked things honest. The wedding was small by design and large by the standards of a town that made what it could of occasions. Mrs. Harlan provided flowers of the preserved winter variety and a great deal of feeling. Otis wore a coat that had clearly been saved for events of significance and sat in the front row with the air of a man who had been waiting for this outcome, and found the confirmation deeply satisfying. The 11 students of the Harlan Creek School sat together in a group, and behaved with a conscientiousness that their teacher found both touching and slightly suspicious. Virginia wore a dress that had been her mother's, and that she had kept all these years through every move and every change, knowing it was for something without knowing what. It was cream-colored and simply cut and slightly too long, and she had altered the sleeves herself in the 2 weeks before the ceremony. When she came out of the church anteroom and Jedediah saw her, he went very still in the way she knew now as the thing he did when something moved him deeply. And then his jaw tightened and his eyes were very bright, and she went down the aisle toward him with the particular confidence of a woman who knows exactly where she is going and is glad of it. He took her hands at the altar, and his were warm and steady and a little rough from the work. And the Reverend said the words, and they said theirs. And when he kissed her, the whole church made a sound that was essentially unanimous satisfaction. Outside, in the February cold, Otis threw his hat in the air, and Cooper, who Virginia had insisted be brought to stand outside the church because he had after all been the reason for all of it, nickered at the commotion in a way that everyone agreed was celebratory. Spring came to the ranch with the generosity that follows a hard winter, green so vivid after the months of brown, and white that it seemed excessive, almost too much, the kind of beauty that made you feel slightly unprepared. Virginia planted the flower bed along the front of the house because the turned soil had been waiting, and she planted it with the deliberateness of someone who intended to be here to see it bloom in every subsequent season. She continued teaching. The school had a second-hand bookshelf now, and maps on the wall that she had acquired through a combination of charm and persistence, and a small science collection that had been donated by a mining engineer who passed through town and was delighted to find someone who knew what the instruments were for. Her students were learning to read with a competency that made her genuinely proud, and the oldest of them, a girl named Pearl whose father worked at the livery stable, was showing a mathematical ability that Virginia was quietly determined to see nurtured into something. She wrote the letter to the Territorial Board of Education about Pearl's situation herself, in the spring, the same way she had written the letter about books, firmly and specifically, making the case in the language she had learned from her father's legal mind. The letter produced a response, and the response produced a scholarship opportunity, and Pearl Whitmore would begin at a proper school in the fall of the following year, and Virginia considered this one of the finest things she had done in her life. Jedediah's ranch grew by modest degrees, which was the proper speed for honest growth. He bought 2 more cattle in the spring and expanded the south pasture once the fence situation was properly resolved. He hired a second-hand part-time, a young man named Henry who was 19 and earnest and clumsy with horses in a way he was slowly correcting. Jedediah taught with the patience that Virginia had noticed from the first, the same quality he brought to every difficult thing, steady and present and without judgment, and Henry improved visibly under it. The Alderton situation resolved itself by degrees as well. Dale Alderton, it turned out, was not a fundamentally bad man but a frightened one, facing debts of his own that had made the old promissory note look like salvation. Virginia helped him understand, through Jedediah, that the document was genuinely unenforceable, and then, because she was thorough, she helped him find the actual records of what his father had owed and been owed, and the real number was much smaller than Dale had feared. It did not create a friendship, but it created a functional peace, which was most of what neighbors in that country required of each other. She thought about her father often, with the texture of grief that becomes over time less a wound and more a weather, something you are aware of and have learned to read. She talked to Cooper about him still in the mornings, which Jedediah knew and left unremarked upon in the way he always left her private things private, as a gift. One morning in late spring, she was in the barn doing exactly this, one hand on Cooper's neck and her voice low and conversational, telling the horse about something that had happened at school that week, when she heard the barn door and turned to find Jedediah in the doorway. He was not apologizing for interrupting. He was just looking at her with the look that had no need of definition by this point, the one she saw in the morning and the evening and sometimes across the room for no reason, the look that said he was glad, specifically and completely, that she was here. "I have something to tell you," he said. "Something good?" she asked, because she could tell by the set of his shoulders that it was. "I believe so," he said, though I wanted to be certain before I said it. He came into the barn and stood beside her, and Cooper regarded him with his usual equanimity. "I spoke to Doc Whitfield yesterday. He thinks, come late November or early December, we'll have some additional company." Virginia stared at him. "We're having a baby," he said, with a care that was identical to how he always said the most important things, quietly and directly, as if the thing deserved to be said without decoration. She had known something was different. She had known for 3 weeks and told herself she was being hasty, and then told herself she was being a coward. She looked at Jedediah, at his face that she knew now in the full landscape of its expressions, and she felt the thing in her chest that was larger than any single word she had ever found for it. "I know," she said. He blinked. "You know." "I've known for a while," she said. "I wanted to be certain too." He looked at her for a long moment and then laughed, the full, warm laugh that she had fallen in love with on a cold December street. "Virginia Bailey," he said. "Virginia Bishop," she said. "Virginia Bishop," he said, and it was the best correction she had ever issued. He put his arms around her and she leaned into him in the early morning light of the barn, with Cooper warm and patient beside them, and the spring outside making its elaborate argument about the future. And she felt, with a completeness that required no qualification, that she had arrived. The summer of 1883 was long and beautiful and hard in the ways that summers on the prairie always were, the heat building through July into something that required respect, the garden needing more water than the sky was willing to provide, the cattle moving slow and heavy in the afternoon heat. Virginia continued teaching through July, when the school broke for the summer, and then she had the particular freedom of a woman who has been spending her energy on everyone else's children and can now spend it on other things. She spent it on the house, partly, which she was slowly and deliberately making her own without erasing what it had been. She kept his parents' photograph on the mantel. She kept the books that had always been there. She added books. She sewed curtains for the bedroom window out of a fabric she had found at the general store that was the color of the sky in October, the particular deep blue that appeared for about 3 weeks before the cold came and made the sky go pale. She planted a second garden, a small one for medicinal herbs, because her mother had kept one, and she still knew which plants mattered for what. Jedediah watched all of this with the quiet gladness of a man in whom something that had been closed was now simply, reliably open. He had been alone for long enough that the presence of another person in his days had initially required adjustment, a recalibration of his habits. But Virginia was not a person who required that you accommodate her so much as a person who simply slotted herself into the available spaces and made them better. And he had found, to his honest surprise, that his own rhythms did not feel disrupted but extended, as if he had been operating at half capacity without knowing it. He told her this one evening in July, sitting on the porch in the last of the day's heat with glasses of cold water and the sound of the night insects starting up. He told her because he had told himself a long time ago he would not wait, and also because it was true and she deserved the truth of it. She was quiet for a while after he said it. Then she said, "My father used to say that solitude was a habit you could mistake for a preference." "He was right," Jedediah said. "He was right about most things," she said. "I spent a long time being irritated with him about it." "Because it meant he was right about you too," he said. She gave him a look that acknowledged the accuracy of this without offering any additional concessions. "He said I would argue with a stone wall if I thought it was wrong," she said. "What he failed to mention is that I'm usually right." "You are usually right," he said agreeably. "You're not supposed to just agree," she said. "I've found it's the more efficient approach," he said. She threw a small pebble at him from the step, which he caught, and the ease of it was so complete and so specific to them that she thought about it later, lying in the dark with his arm around her and the summer night very warm and full of sound, and she thought that ease was the underrated luxury of the well-matched, the thing people did not write enough songs about. August passed. September came back around. 1 full year from when she had ridden up the ranch road on a borrowed mare with $47 and a loaded pistol, and the symmetry of it was not lost on her. She had marked the anniversary in her own private way, which was to ride Cooper out to the south pasture early in the morning and sit on the horse in the September light and look at the land that was hers now, specifically hers in the way that things become yours when you have committed to them entirely. The baby was born in the last days of November, which was exactly what the doctor had predicted, and it was born on a Wednesday morning with Jedediah pacing the kitchen in a state of controlled agitation that was the most undone she had ever seen him, and with Mrs. Harlan in the bedroom being more useful than Virginia had expected from a woman of her energy, and with Otis sitting on the porch in the November cold in a posture of solidarity that was genuinely touching. The baby was a boy, which surprised Virginia, who had formed a private picture of a daughter for reasons she could not fully articulate. He was red-faced and furious about being born, which she found deeply relatable, and he weighed, according to the doctor, a healthy amount, and he had Jedediah's dark hair, a small soft tuft of it, and Virginia's stubbornness, which could not be seen yet but which everyone who knew his parents accepted as given. Jedediah held his son for the first time with the same careful gravity he brought to everything that mattered, and he looked at the child and then at Virginia, and the look between them was the kind that does not need language because language is too small for it. "Robert," Virginia said, "if that is all right with you." He looked at her. "That is more than all right with me," he said. They named him Robert Jedediah Bishop, and he was called Robbie, which was a name that had energy in it, and which suited him. Robbie was 4 months old when Pearl Whitmore left for her new school with a copy of a mathematics textbook that Virginia had ordered specially, inscribed in the front, "For Pearl, who will go further than any of us can see." Pearl was 14, and she was composed about it in the way that very clever girls learn to be composed about the large things, keeping the feeling interior so the world would not see it and try to diminish it. But she hugged Virginia for a long moment before she got into the wagon, and Virginia hugged her back with the fullness that a teacher reserves for the student who has made the whole difficult business of teaching worth doing. Spring came again, and the flower bed bloomed, because Virginia had planted it right and tended it faithfully, and the colors were everything she had imagined when she planted it. Red and yellow, and a particular shade of orange that she had not expected from the packet's description but found she loved. Jedediah cut her one of the orange ones and put it in a glass on the kitchen table without comment, and she looked at it every morning. The cattle operation grew again, steadily, the right kind of growth that does not outpace the capacity to maintain it. Jedediah knew exactly what his land could sustain, and he never pushed past it, which was a principle Virginia applied to most things and found admirably sensible in him. Henry, the earnest young hand, had grown into a genuinely competent horseman, and he was now managing most of the day-to-day riding with an efficiency that gave Jedediah more time for the things he had been putting off, repairs and improvements, and the expanding fence line. Virginia returned to teaching in the fall, with Robbie cared for in the mornings by a woman named Clara who lived in town, and who Robbie apparently found deeply satisfying as a companion, which Clara reciprocated with an enthusiasm that gave Virginia no concern about leaving him. She brought Robbie to the school in the afternoons, which her students found extraordinary and wonderful, and which became one of those small institutional traditions that attach themselves to places. She had 14 students in her second year of teaching, 3 more than the first, which meant the school's reputation was producing results. She had received in the fall a letter from the Territorial Education Board acknowledging her contributions to the school's development, which she read once and put in a drawer, because the acknowledgement that mattered was the one she saw on her students' faces when something opened for them, the particular moment when understanding arrived, which she had never once tired of witnessing. One evening in the 2nd October, when Robbie was sleeping and the house was warm and the fire was burning well, and the cottonwoods were doing their October gold outside the window, Jedediah put down the book he was reading and looked at her across the room. "Are you happy?" he said. It was the kind of question that required a real answer rather than a social one. Virginia looked around the room, which was theirs, and out the window at the land, which was theirs, and back at him, who was the best of all of it. "Yes," she said, "completely." "Good," he said, and picked up his book again. She looked at him for another moment, at the familiar shape of him in the lamplight, and she thought about a woman who had ridden into a town on a borrowed mare with $47, and the determination of someone who had nothing left to lose, and who had come for a horse and found considerably more than that. She thought about how grief had brought her here and love had kept her, and how her father had managed from his sickbed to arrange the most important circumstance of her life, which was exactly the kind of thing he would do, operating with that quiet intelligence in directions she could only see fully afterward. She thought she would like to tell him about it. She thought she would tell Cooper instead in the morning, which was the same thing in its way. The letter from Missouri came in November, from her second cousin, whose name was Eleanor, and who had over the course of their correspondence become something more than a distant obligation. Eleanor was coming west, she wrote, because her husband had died the previous winter and she had 2 children and she had been thinking about starting over, and she had read Virginia's letters about Harlan Creek until she felt she knew the place, and she wondered if Virginia thought there was room there for a person who wanted to begin again. Virginia wrote back immediately, "Come." And Eleanor came, in January of 1884, on the westbound train, with 2 small children and 5 cases, and a determination that Virginia recognized on sight as a family trait. She was 41, dark-haired like Virginia, and she had a dry, quiet humor that had clearly survived considerable difficulty. Jedediah, who had trusted Virginia's word about her, was in the wagon at the train station, and he helped load the 5 cases without comment and drove them out to the ranch where the spare room was waiting. Eleanor stayed in the spare room for 2 months, and in that time she found work at Mrs. Harlan's dry goods enterprise, and found a small house at the edge of town that she could afford on her own, and found that Harlan Creek was a town that would take in a woman starting over and make what she could of her, rather than making less of her because of what she had been through. Eleanor and Otis developed, within 3 months, an argumentative friendship of such specific intensity that everyone in the immediate vicinity agreed it was the most entertaining feature of any given week. Otis had opinions about everything. Eleanor had the same opinions, more precisely expressed. They disagreed about these shared opinions with a passion that seemed inexplicable from the outside and made complete sense to them. Virginia watched this with the profound interest of someone who had learned to see things for what they actually were rather than what they appeared to be. She mentioned this to Jedediah one evening, and he said that he had been watching it for about a month and had come to the same conclusion and was trying to figure out if it was any of their business. She said probably not, but that didn't mean they couldn't observe. They observed. Eventually, in the late spring, the situation arrived at its natural resolution, and Otis came to the ranch one morning with the expression of a man who had been surprised by his own feelings and was not entirely at peace with the surprise. And he stood in the yard and told Jedediah that he had asked Eleanor Marsh if she would consider walking out with him, and she had said she would consider it, and he wanted Jedediah's honest opinion on whether he was being a fool. Jedediah told him he was not being a fool. He also told Virginia afterward, in the kitchen, and Virginia made a sound of such complete satisfaction that the baby, who was by then walking with the particular determined wobble of the newly ambulatory, looked up from what he was doing and laughed in sympathy. Eleanor Marsh and Otis Briggs were married in the summer of 1884, which was 2 years after Virginia had ridden into Harlan Creek on a borrowed mare, and the wedding was smaller than Virginia's but no less genuine, and Mrs. Harlan provided flowers again and cried at both the ceremony and the reception, which she said was her right. The Bishop Ranch by the end of 1884 was a different place than it had been when Virginia arrived, not larger in any dramatic sense, not fundamentally changed in its geography or purpose, but changed in the way that a house changes when it is truly lived in, when it accumulates the specific evidence of people who care about it, and about each other. There were flowers along the porch from Virginia's bed, which she had extended. There were children's drawings pinned to the kitchen wall, Robbie's first efforts at representation, which included a horse that was identifiably a horse if you were generous, and which Jedediah had declared without irony to be the finest horse picture he had ever seen. There were more books on the shelf. There was a new rocking chair on the porch that Jedediah had made over the winter from the wood of a fallen cottonwood, taking his time with it because he wanted it to be right. And Virginia had found him working on it one evening in the barn, and had sat beside him on a hay bale and read aloud to him from the poetry collection she had bought at the general store the day she arrived, and neither of them had mentioned the particular roundness of that moment. Cooper was 12 now, which was not old for a sound horse well cared for, but which meant that Virginia thought about him differently, with the attention to time that comes when you understand that things you love have their specific season. She rode him still most mornings, the ride to school and back, and he carried her with the smooth, collected stride she had felt the first time she sat on him, the same stride her father had loved, and she let herself be grateful for all of it, the horse and the man and the road and the town and the life that had assembled itself out of grief and a borrowed mare and $47, and the absolute necessity of going to collect what her father had left behind. In the spring of 1885, the doctor informed them they were expecting again, and this time Virginia had a private bet with herself about whether her private picture would be accurate, and it was, because the baby born in October of 1885 was a girl, red-faced and opinionated from the first moment, which Virginia took as a sign that the child already knew who she was. They named her Clara Rose Bishop, Clara for the woman who loved Robbie, and Rose because the roses Virginia had planted that spring had done something extraordinary, coming in a deep red she had not quite expected, and which bloomed so vigorously and so repeatedly that even Jedediah, who appreciated the garden without being particularly verbal about it, had come out one morning and stood in front of them for a long moment before going about his day. Robbie was 3 when Clara was born, and he received his sister with a 2-year-old's mixture of enthusiasm and suspicion that resolved itself within a week into a proprietorial fondness, standing beside her cradle with the solemn seriousness of someone newly appointed to an important post. He called her Clara in a voice that was trying for the dignity of the name and hadn't quite got the syllables in the right order yet, and it was the best sound Virginia had heard since his birth. Mrs. Harlan, who had attached herself to the Bishop family with the completeness of someone who had recognized good people and decided to stay near them, held Clara at the baptism with the expression of a woman in total possession of the moment she was in, and said afterward that Harlan Creek was a very fortunate town to have the Bishops in it, and Virginia, who did not usually receive this kind of thing gracefully, found that she could receive it now without deflecting, because she felt fortunate too, specifically and deeply, in a way that she had room for now. The years moved in the way that good years do, which is to say both quickly and completely, packed with the specific material of a life that is working. Robbie grew into a boy with his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, a combination that produced someone who was very easy to like and occasionally difficult to argue with. Clara grew into a girl with her mother's precision and her father's patience, and these two qualities together made her the kind of child who took things apart carefully and could usually put them back together. Pearl Whitmore wrote from her school. The letters were full of mathematics and some of the most creative punctuation Virginia had ever encountered, and Virginia wrote back every time promptly, with responses that took Pearl's work seriously and pushed her further. The correspondence became, over the years, one of the things Virginia counted among her best uses of time. The school in Harlan Creek grew to accommodate 20 students by 1887, which required the town to take the question of a larger building seriously, and Mrs. Harlan organized the civic response with the focused energy of a woman who had been waiting for a project worthy of her. The new schoolhouse was built that summer out of the same pale limestone as the Bishop house, solid and warm and large enough to grow into, and Virginia stood in it on the opening morning with the 20 faces of her students looking at her, and thought of her father's patience and his precision and his belief that what you put into things was exactly what you got out, no more and no less. Jedediah came to the opening. He sat in the back with Robbie in his lap, because Robbie was now 5 and fully committed to attending school but not yet technically enrolled, and he watched his wife stand in front of 20 children and explain what this building was for and what they would do in it, and his face had the expression she knew, quiet and open and specific to her. The look she had first seen on the porch of his ranch the morning she rode up out of the dust with $47 and a borrowed mare and more determination than she had known what to do with. She caught his eye from across the room over the heads of 20 children, and the look between them was the conversation they had been having since that first morning, the one without words that said, "You, specifically you, across any room." Later, when the children had gone home and the schoolhouse was empty and the afternoon light was long and golden through the new windows, Jedediah helped her straighten the desks and she said, "My father would have loved this." "He would have argued with the desk spacing," Jedediah said. "He would have argued with the desk spacing," she agreed, and laughed. And the laughter was the fully resolved kind, the kind that holds the grief inside it lightly, that has made peace with what it carries. She took his hand on the way out of the school, and they walked to where the horses were tied, Cooper patient as ever and Samson regarding the new building with the mild interest of a horse who has seen a great deal and classified most of it as not immediately relevant. The September air was cool and carried the smell of the land in its particular autumn mode, dry and sage-scented and very clear. Cooper turned his head as she came to him, and she put her hand on his nose in the way she always did, and he exhaled slowly, warm against her palm. "Come on, then," she said to the horse, to her husband, to the afternoon, to all of it. They rode home together on the road that had become, over 5 years of riding, her road, theirs, the road between the school where she gave her days and the house where she gave everything else. The cottonwoods along the road were turning, gold coming in at the edges of each leaf, the way light comes through a window at the end of the day. The ranch came into view between them as it always did, the low limestone house, the solid barn, the windmill turning steadily against the blue sky, the fence lines clean and tended, the flower bed along the porch still holding a few of the last roses of the season, red against the pale stone. Virginia looked at it and knew, with the particular certainty that requires no argument, that she was home. She had come here for a horse. She had come with grief, and not much else, with the practical determination of a woman who had learned that you kept moving, because stopping was more frightening than the distance ahead of you. She had come for Cooper, and she had found this man and this land and this town and this life, which was not the life she had been managing toward when she packed her father's house in Abilene. It was better than that life, better in the way that things are better when they are not planned but found, when you arrive at something you did not know you were looking for and recognize it anyway. Jedediah rode beside her into the yard, and they dismounted, and he took the horses, and she went into the house where Robbie was helping Clara work out how to stand without falling down, which was going approximately as well as it sounds, and Clara was making her opinions about the difficulty of the enterprise very clearly known, and the kitchen smelled of the soup she had started that morning, and the fire needed a log added, and the afternoon light was coming through the October blue curtains in long, warm bars. Virginia added the log to the fire. She looked at her children. She listened to the sound of her husband with the horses in the yard. She thought of her father with a love that was clean and full, and without the rawness of early grief, the love that has had time to become something that holds rather than something that wounds. She thought of the road that had brought her here, all its contingencies, the illness and the death and the horse and the road from Abilene and the borrowed mare that had needed rest and the coffee and the limestone kitchen, and the evenings on the porch and the storm and the lantern in the road and the December street, and the kiss that meant something had been decided, and every morning since then, every ordinary, extraordinary morning. She thought, I collected my father's horse and everything else followed. Robbie looked up from his supervision of Clara's efforts and said, in the tone of an official report, she stood up and then fell down 7 times. 8, Clara said, with great dignity from the floor. Virginia crouched down and picked up her daughter and held her, warm and solid and smelling of the particular good smell of small children, and Clara patted her mother's face with one hand in the way she had started doing recently, a gesture of such complete possession that it made Virginia's whole chest ache with love. 8 times is very good for one afternoon, Virginia said. I know, said Clara. Outside, Jedediah finished with the horses and came across the yard and up the porch steps and through the door. And the house arranged itself around all of them the way it had arranged itself around the generations of bishops before Virginia came and would arrange itself around the generations after, solid and warm and real, built of limestone that had been here before them and would be here after, holding the heat of the day against the coming cold of the night, doing what a good house does, which is to keep the people inside it safe and together and close to the fire. Virginia looked at her husband across the kitchen, with the children between them and the evening coming on outside and the soup warming on the stove and the whole long good future of their life opening ahead, and she thought that she was the most fortunate woman on the great plains of Kansas in the year of our Lord 1887, and that she would not change a single mile of the road that had brought her here, not 1 mile, not even the ones that had been hard. Supper in an hour, she said. Good, Jedediah said, and hung his coat on the hook by the door and came to help.